Hello, welcome back to our Simulating Neurobiological Systems course, Systems 556, 750, taught at the University of Waterloo in the fall term of 2021. Today we are going to talk about high-level cognition, and in particular cognitive control and action selection. So this is going to be a particular hypothesis about how to organize a large-scale algorithm that is going to be running in biology. Okay, so far in the course we've said, how can functions get implemented in neurons? How can differential equations be implemented in neurons? We've talked recently about how symbols and symbol structures might be implemented in neurons. And now we're going to get actually sort of the final step of how would you build something like a cognitive system, like some sort of system that can do reasoning and have logical steps. Okay, so that's where we're going to get to. The particular set of notes that I have here is in a slightly different format than the notes we've seen in the course so far. They're sort of, I want to treat this as sort of complementary to the existing course notes. We'll see whether presenting it this way gives sort of slightly different insights than the other notes. But anyway, both sets of notes are available, so whichever one works best. Where am I trying to go with this? All right. One of the examples we had of trying to build up a full brain, I did a quick little video of trying to build a simple brain where there was a little critter that could, you could tell it what direction food was in, and you could tell it how bright the environment was, and if the thing was dark, so it was, how bright it was sort of an indication of how scared it should be, meaning that if it's scared, i.e. if it's bright out, then it should run back to where it started from. But if it's dark, then it's fine for it to wander out there and it can go off and do things. And that was sort of the minimal example of having some sort of cognitive control, some sort of, hey, in some situations the brain is going to do one thing, in other situations the brain is going to do something else. Okay? And the brain needs to make some sort of decision based on this. And we implemented that with a little if statement that was sort of, we built one little thing that would sort of say, well, if you're scared, then output 0, otherwise output this. And we can sort of implement these functions like that. And I sort of mentioned at the end of that chunk that that's not going to scale well. What about more complex examples? What about if you have 3 different actions you're choosing between? What do you have 4 different actions you're choosing? Fine. Like the example that we did sort of worked really well because there was two things it could do, either go towards the food or not. Things are going to get much more complicated if we have more actions. So we want to be able to scale up from that. How are we going to do this? Traditionally in cognitive science, this task is something that all cognitive models have to deal with. If you're going to have some sort of model of cognition, you've got to have some sort of theory about how this is done. And most of these theories end up breaking things down into a couple parts. One aspect is action selection, which is choosing, I've got a bunch of actions, I'm going to choose one of them to perform. And then we're going to separate that out from action execution, which is actually saying, okay, how do the neurons go ahead and do action A, action B, action C? Okay. And it's also really clear, we have to be careful in this particular terminology, that by action, we don't just mean sort of physical movements. We could also mean something like, in this situation, move your attention, or change the contents of your memory. Or so if I'm thinking about the letter A, then think about, and I'm in the midst of, if I'm thinking about the number 3 and I'm in the midst of counting, then my action could be change, instead of thinking about 3, now think about 4. Okay, that could be an action. Another action could be trying to recall from memory. I don't know, if someone asks me what 7 times 8 is, then one of my actions might be try to recall from memory. Do I know what 7 times 8 is? That could be an action. So anyway, so we've got all of these sorts of cognitive actions. Our sort of overall theory is that the actual actions themselves could be implemented using functions and differential equations and all these components we've talked about so far in the course. But we need something to choose between which one we should do right now. Okay. All right, and we're going to separate this into action selection and action execution. Okay, so it's one thing to choose which action we're going to do, and then it's another thing to actually perform that action, to figure out how is it that we send a signal in the brain that tells this chunk of neurons to, okay, go ahead and do this computation now. All right, so that's our overall plan. So let's start with this action selection thing. The only thing all this is I have lots of different actions, and I want to pick one of them to perform. Okay. There's many different things I could do at any given instant. I got to pick one. Okay. How are we going to do that? And the approach that we're going to take is we're just going to steal stuff from reinforcement learning. Okay. So there's this field called reinforcement learning where there's lots of different actions, and the system sort of learns what actions to do in different cases. And the way that tends to get cashed out is just this idea of, oh, hold on. At any given moment, I'm in some state. We'll call that S. And then for all of my actions, maybe there's some function that's computed so that given your state and an action, I've got some measure of how good it is to do that action right now. And then the idea would be that if you're in a state and you have, 50 different actions, you can go ahead and find, okay, let's compute what this Q value is for each of these actions. Q just tends to be the term that's most often used for this, sometimes V for value. But we've got this sort of, some sort of numerical value, and we have a different numerical value for each action, and then we just pick the action with the largest Q, given the current state. There's lots and lots of variations there. Do you just pick the biggest? Do you have some sort of random distribution on there? Tons of stuff. That's a whole course on reinforcement learning. But that's the sort of framework. And in reinforcement learning, the goal is let's just learn these functions, the functions that map from states to actions. We're not going to worry about that. We'll worry about learning in a future lecture. Actually, that'll be the next set after this set. Not tomorrow, that should say next week. We'll worry about actually learning these things next week. But for now, this is just a function. We know how to get neurons to compute functions. We can do that, no problem. Right. So if we have some situations where we have some state, some knowledge the system has about the world, and we have a bunch of actions, well and if we know these functions, if we know what we want the system to do, we want the system to do particular things in particular situations, then we just design these Q functions, get the neurons to approximate that, and everything's great, right? Now we've got a bunch of utility values, just pick the biggest and do that. I want to show an example of this that's sort of at this sort of high level, just to give a both a concrete example of this and to also give a sense of how one might use this in a mental task. And the particular example that I want to use is a model that was developed by myself and Julia Wertheim at the University of Freiburg. This is also sort of a nice, somewhat simple cognitive model that would sort of be buildable and using the basic components that we have in this course. For those people that are taking the 750 version of the course, this might be a reasonable version of something that you might do as a final project, so something at this sort of scale. The particular task that she was interested in was this sort of spatial reasoning task. And this is the task that you can ask people about, where it's like, okay, you tell someone that A is left of B, and that B is to the left of C, and then you can ask questions. You can say, okay, well, is A to the left of C? Okay. And there's a bunch of different theories about how people do this. This is one of those tasks where if you implement that in sort of a normal computer algorithm that's like pretty trivial to write a computer program that can do those sorts of tasks perfectly. But people definitely don't do those sorts of tasks perfectly. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to figure out what it is that people do when asked to do this sort of task. And one of those examples, one of those theories is called preferred mental model theory. And the idea is that when someone's given a sequence of tasks like that, what they're doing is they're building an internal imagination of what's going on. When you say A is to the left of B, they're like, okay, I'll imagine there's an A, and I'll imagine there's a B, and I'm just going to sort of picture it such that the A and the B are beside each other, and the B is just sort of to the right of the A, and the A is to the left of the B. And then someone tells me B is to the left of C, and I'm like, okay, now I'm going to add into my picture that there's an A and a B, and there's a C just beside that. Now, okay, so B is now to the left of C, everything's fine. And now when I come to the statement, is A left of C, all I have to do is go look at my mental picture, and I can just check in that mental picture, is A left of C. Okay. That's a particular approach. There's some interesting evidence that that's what people, or at least some people, do when these sorts of tasks. The negative aspect of that particular theory, and why that doesn't give you perfect results all the time, is there's lots of situations where you can give people sort of ambiguous data, where it's unclear where one item is, and so that's how you can sort of trick people, or not trick people, but why that sort of preferred mental model theory, the idea that you're just coming up with one internal mental picture of where things are, might lead to things that lead to believing things that aren't quite exactly true, because there might be more than one mental picture that would work given the ideas that we're given. But if our goal is to model what humans are doing, if that's what we're trying to understand, then we want the system to do what humans do, and hopefully it'll make the same sorts of mistakes that people make. Okay. So how are we going to translate this sort of task into the sorts of components that we've seen so far? Okay, so this is the final published model, and I'm just sort of going to go through the individual parts, and then that's going to lead us to this question of what's going on with this action selection system. So first of all, we are going to be doing this sort of vector symbolic approach, this semantic pointer approach, this idea of, okay, we have symbols, I need to represent them in vectors. So I'm going to start with what are all the different symbols I need to represent? And for each of those symbols, I'm going to have a vector. In this particular theory, we have items A, B, C, and D. We have the idea of being left of and being right of. We also extended it to also find, you could have below and above, taller and shorter, things like that. And then also, in order to represent these full phrases, A left of B, then I'm going to need to know something like, all right, what's the subject of the statement, what's the object of the statement, and what's the relation being encoded. So what do I mean by that? Well, as an example, this might be a vector that we're feeding in. Okay, I might have the vector. If I wanted to feed into my model the statement A is to the left of B, the way I would do that is I would go ahead and compute a vector that is, all right, I've randomly generated some vector that means A, I've randomly generated some vector that means the subject, left of, right of, or relation, B, and object. These are just 6 randomly chosen vectors. And this operation here, I'm using a different symbol in these sets of notes, but fine, this is the circular convolution operation that we were talking about before. I do this math, that gives me a vector, that's the vector I'm inputting to the front of this system. Okay. Just saying A left of B. Cool. What am I going to do inside this? Well, the first thing I'm going to want to do is fine, I'm feeding in that whole vector, let's extract out the information that's inside it. So for example, I want to have this group of neurons encode what's the relation that's currently being represented. And the mathematical operation to do that is to take the premise and compute the circular convolution with the premise and the pseudo-inverse of the vector for relation. Right? That's the operation that's supposed to supposed to extract out the information. And if I do that, if I was given this as the input, then I should, in this population here, representing a vector that is somewhere near the vector for left of. It won't be It won't be exactly, but it should be pretty close. Okay. And I could do the same thing for subject and object. Right, so that is just, again, what we showed in the previous class about representing symbols. Once you combine information together, you can extract it back out. Okay. One nice thing is that this operation here, circular convolution by a fixed vector, that's actually a linear operation. That's actually just turns into a matrix multiply. So it is just a matrix multiply to take you from this vector to this vector. Okay, so that's kind of cool. So I know, since I know it's a linear operation, I know it's something that neurons are good at approximating. I can just go ahead and compute the decoder to take my information from here to here. Okay. There's some other stuff that you can do in this process. You could do something like you could add a little bit of dynamics or a little bit of operations going on here that would sort of clean the value up. So because I'm gonna have some vector in here that's near the vector for left of. If I add in some extra calculations, I could do something like, okay, if you're representing something that's near this particular vector, then approximate it to be closer to the actual vector. We could add those sorts of components. That's called cleanup memory. Not necessary for this task, but it's also a thing that can be done. But in any case, we're just going to have components in here that are just representing that extracted out information. So these three populations should now represent whatever statement is being fed in. I've got this group of neurons is going to represent A, this group of neurons is representing left of, and this group of neurons is representing B. That would be, say, A left of B. So that's how I'm going to represent my input statement. How am I going to represent that internal picture I was just imagining of, oh, there's an A at this location and a B at this location? Bunch of different possibilities here, but here's one particular approach. What I'm going to do, so if I'm imagining an A and a B at sort of different locations on the x-axis, say, then what I can do is if I want to, so let's say I wanted to say that there's an A at position 0.3 on the x-axis and there's a B at position 0.7 on the x-axis. It's a thing I could do. If I wanted to imagine, so what vector, I mean, my neurons are always going to be representing vectors. What vector do I want to represent? And here's one possible answer to that. So I could take A, convolve it with, so I have a randomly generated vector that means X. A convolved with X, and I multiply that by 0.3. That would give me, all right, that would be one way of representing that there is an A at this particular position on the x-axis, and there's a B at this particular position on the x-axis. Okay. Because A and B are different vectors, these sorts of things are going to be just different, like they're not going to cancel out, there's not going to interfere with each other or anything. These are just, all right, some vectors in some high-dimensional space. Okay? And so this is sort of one way that I could represent an A at this location to B at some other location. One nice thing with this approach is I could have multiple objects. I could have C, D, E, and F. I could also have different relations. I could have things on the x-axis, I could have things on the y-axis, I could have on the z-axis. I could also do other more abstract axes, like if I wanted to say, okay, which one's taller than others, I could have a tallness axis. There's nothing that says these have to be spatial dimensions, they're just vectors. So I could do that sort of thing. And of course, my difficulty is then going to be is that the more things I cram into this imagination, now at some point you're going to start having interference between these sorts of things. At some point, as you change one value, that's sort of going to affect other values and things like that. So you'll have both your accuracy decreasing and also this vector, since we're storing it in neurons, we're not going to perfectly store it. Okay. We want this vector to sort of be stable over time. So that means we're going to need an integrator. We're going to need these neurons set up such that if there's no external input, they're just going to sit there and maintain whatever value they were given. Okay. So that is exactly the integrator model that we have been using in the last couple lectures. Okay, that's one possibility. What else do we need? Well, one other thing that we also need an output from the system, and the only output from the system is sort of, is the statement that I'm currently being given, is it valid or not? Is it true or not? And fine, for that, we're just going to do exactly the same sort of other thing. We've got an output population that is also representing high-dimensional vectors, and fine, all right, I got a vector for valid and a vector for invalid. Why not? So that's going to be my basic setup for trying to solve this task. What's going on over here? So over there, this is where we're going to put this whole thing I'm calling cognitive control. And at a high level, this is the algorithm I want to implement. I've got something being currently imagined in this model. Okay. What I'd really like to do is, I've got this model, I've got some premise being fed in, I've got something that I'm imagining right now. If someone's feeding me a premise and it matches, right? So if the premise, if someone says A is left of B, and I'm like, okay, well, yes, A is to the left of B inside my imagination, then fine. The only thing we should do is set the output to be the vector valid, right? And otherwise, we're going to set this thing to invalid, and we're going to modify our model. We're going to adjust the vector that's being stored in the model in order to make it more valid. Okay, we're going to move A and B in my imagination in order to make these things happen. Okay, that's my overall picture of what's going on. How am I going to turn this chunk here? How am I going to turn this statement here into vectors and functions on vectors and differential equations? Well, I've already said that what we're going to do is we're going to break this into two parts. We're going to say, okay, I want some sort of function that I can evaluate, that given my state, and my state is what's in my model and what's in the input that is being given to me. Okay. Given those things, I'm going to compute some function. I've got a bunch of these functions, one for each action. And I want those actions to be, I want to be able to compute some number, and then if that action, if a particular action has the highest number, then I should do that action. And that's how I'm going to break up this if otherwise statement. Okay, how am I going to do that? Well, here's one way of computing that function. So let's start with just being able to deal with statements of the form something is to the left of something else. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to write a couple actions. These are actions that are dealing with A is left of B, B is left of C, something is left of something else. Okay. And I'm going to have two of them. I'm going to have one action for somebody tells me something is left of something else, and that's true. It's true of my model. And I'm going to have a different action that is someone tells me something is left of something else, and that's false of my model, right? Because I want to do different things in those two cases. So, and now what I've got to do is I've got to come up with some math that will guarantee that this particular action has a large Q value, has a large sort of, yes, this is a good action to be doing right now measurement. And it'll be sort of a large value in the cases where I want this action to occur. Okay. Lots of different math I could come up with to do that. Here's one possibility. So first of all, I only want these actions to have a high utility, to have a high Q value, if someone is telling me that yes, a statement, something is left of something else. So I'm going to have part of this utility, part of this thing that is, take whatever's in this relation population, do the dot product of that and left of. That'll give me a big number, if someone is giving me an action, a statement that is something is left of something else. If somebody is saying something is to the right of something else, I'm going to get a low number for this dot product, and so this Q is going to have a low value, and it won't get chosen as the action to do. Okay, that tells me that I'll get a large value if it's to the left of. Fine. But now I've got two different cases. I want one action that will be happening if this statement is true, and one action will happen if the statement is false. How can I compute that? Well, this model thing, I know what the vector, I'm getting some vector for my, something is left of something else. I can take a look at my model, and I could do the dot product of whatever vector is in my model with whatever is in the subject population convolved with the vector for x. What? Well, if I go back a little bit and remember what was in my model, if this subject thing was representing A, so if someone's telling me A is left of X, or A is left of B, or A is left of something, right? Then taking A and convolving that with X, that's going to give me the vector A convolved with X, and then the dot product of this whole thing, this model, that's the vector that's sitting in model, the dot product of this whole thing with A convolved with X should be somewhere around 0.3, right? Because the dot product of A convolved with X with A convolved with X, that should be near 1. So the dot product of that with that was 0.3. The dot product of A convolved with X with something else should be near 0. 0 times 0.7 is 0. So I should get a value that's near 0.3. Okay. So this here should be something like the numerical value that I'm currently imagining that this object is at. Similarly, this thing here, which is the dot product with that, is something like the circular convolution with the, something like the location that I'm imagining this object is at. Okay. And now my function is just, okay, if I subtract those two, if I do where is this subject minus where is this object, okay, this will be a large number in the case where it's not actually left of, when this object is not actually to the left of that. That's when this function will have a larger value than this one. In this bottom one, I've just swapped the two. So these two functions, so because of this first term, these actions will have a high utility in the case where someone is telling me a statement, something is to the left of something else. So, and then given where I'm actually imagining these two objects to be, that's going to make one of these two things have a higher utility than the other. Okay. Hopefully we can sort of see, all right, this is a weird hand-designed function that would be sort of a way of implementing the idea of being given a statement, and I've got some internal representation, and I'm checking whether that internal representation is true or false of that, or whether the statement is true or false of that internal representation. And all of the operations that I'm showing here are all things that we know neurons can compute well. Okay? This sort of dot product with a fixed vector, that's a linear operation. Right? We definitely know neurons can compute that well. This is actually a slightly trickier. So the circular convolution of a vector with a fixed vector, that is a linear operation. That's good. But this here is the dot product between two vectors. Right? So that is saying, okay, I need the dot product between this and some linear transform of this. Okay. That is a nonlinear operation, but it's just the dot product. It's just a bunch of pairwise multiplies. Right? So this is something that it's not too bad to get neurons to compute that. Okay. So I know that these are all operations that neurons are good at computing. We know how to get neurons to compute that. It'll be all set. Is this the best possible way of modeling this? Probably not. There's nothing that says that neurons should be restricted to doing things that are nicely written in math. But this is more sort of, here's a first pass guess of me doing a high level sort of analysis of how I might implement something using neurons. There's probably a much larger family of functions that we might go ahead and explore to do a better job of that. But this was our first guess in this particular research. It might even be some function that isn't easy to write out in math, because there's nothing that forces neurons to compute things that are easy to write out in math. Okay, but the idea is going to be, I've got a bunch of different actions, 2 for each term that I know about, left of, right of, above, below, etc., etc., etc. For each term that I have 2 actions. What am I going to do? So we're going to have those 2 actions. I've got a bunch of these functions. We're going to have some computation happening that is going to give me one numerical value for each action. And then the point is going to be to do this action selection is just pick the biggest of those and then go do an action based on which one we picked. We will get to this details in a moment. I just want to say a little bit about what this action execution is going to be doing once we've picked that action. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to say, all right, so the output, once we pick the action, we're going to have something like, here's some variable a that is 1 if I'm choosing that action and 0 if I'm not choosing that action. Okay. That'll be sort of where the punchline is. And now what I need to do is know what to do when I, how do I go ahead and, again, implement some function that says, well, based on what that variable is, produce some behavior. And again, everything has to turn into functions in differential equations. One easy one is this status output. So if this output should be the vector valid, if one of the valid actions has been chosen, or if one of the actions that says this is valid has been chosen, and it should be invalid if one of the actions that says this is invalid has been chosen. That's easy to write out, right? That is just fine. If I have this vector that is 0 if I have not chosen the action and 1 if it has chosen the action, then status is just this function. It's just the vector for invalid times, that shouldn't be circular convolution, that's just multiply, times this particular vector that is 1 if that's been chosen, otherwise 0, plus valid times this, plus, and one of those terms for every single action in the system. Okay, that's going to be a function where if I give it a whole bunch of zeros and a single 1, the status will be what I want. And then similarly, how do I update this model, my mental model of where things are? Well, again, I've got a bunch of these terms. They're going to affect the derivative of this model. So again, this model is just going to be some vector. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up the derivative of this model. So this is going to be an integrator, because the model does not show up in this input in any place. All right. If there is no input, if the input is 0, then the model should stay exactly with what it's doing. Otherwise, this is going to be what we're feeding in. If, for example, the action that I was told this is a left of statement, but it was invalid. If this is a 1, then what I'm going to feed into this model, this thing that's computing the derivative or computing the integral, is just, all right, whatever was in subject convolved with the x location, whatever was an object convolved with the x location, and we're going to subtract the 2. Okay? And what that's going to do is that's going to push my mental model of where this object is to the left, and my mental model of where this object is, it'll push it to the right. Okay? And it'll keep pushing that. If I feed in a premise, that is false, then this derivative will cause this to start pushing those, my mental pictures of where the A and B are, it'll start pushing them until eventually that statement is true. When the statement is true, I'm now going to pick some other action, probably the action that, hey, the statement is now valid, and I'm now going to say this is valid, and my model's not going to get updated anymore. Okay, that's weird logic, that's weird programming. That is a sense of how you can convert a high-level algorithm into something where all the components are things that I know how to implement using neurons. Okay, kind of weird, a little bit different, but that's one particular approach for modeling this particular task. Okay. First of all, I guess I will point out that yes, we published this paper, and it does sort of have all sorts of interesting, we tried a bunch of different tasks that have been tried on humans, and you can go ahead and feed data into the model and record the spiking data and sort of decode out, what's it end up saying. And then you can compare that to human data. Here's what was seen in that model. So over here is the simulation accuracy on these different tasks. And depending on what inputs you feed in, we start getting things like, oh, hey, look, humans have a real hard time with this particular situation, and also the model has a hard time with those situations. And so we had sort of good matches. Not perfect. So certainly there was some sorts of experiments that humans get like 92%, and our model only got like 80%. And this particular here, where the humans get 80% and the model gets like 7%. So there are things missing from the model. But as a first pass, it was sort of kind of interesting. And so yeah, so ongoing research. Can we figure out what this something is wrong here? Can we improve that? Can we tweak other things to make it a little bit better? Okay. Cool. But I kind of skipped a step. And it's a step that didn't actually, initially doesn't seem all that tricky. And that is this determine which action has the highest utility step. And that is my step where, hey, look, I've already got everything that sort of computes. Here are my 6 values. Find me which value is the biggest. Okay. And what are we going to, so how is that going to get implemented? Okay. So, because this initially seems sort of easy, right? We've got some sort of state representation. We're computing this sort of value. Fine, that's okay. That's just a normal connection. That's just a normal, we're decoding some value out of my neurons that are representing state. We're computing some function. I've got a bunch of those, and now we just want to pick out which one is the biggest. And I mean, we do have to determine, okay, as we're defining this function, how are we going to describe which one is biggest? And do we want the output of the function to be, I don't know, maybe the input is 0.2, 0.3, 0.7, 0.1. Do we want the output to be the number 3? Because it's the third item that is the largest. That seems a little weird because we're dealing with neurons, we're dealing with continuous values, so what does the number 3.1 mean, or 3.2, like, that seems ugly. Instead, our output is going to be exactly like something like this, which is, all right, if I feed in 0.2, 0.3, 0.7, 0.1, then I want my output to be 0, 0, 1, 0. I want it to be a 1 for the thing that is largest, 0 for the others. That is, incidentally, exactly these variables here that we're then going to go ahead and use. Okay. All right, so how are we going to do this? Well, let's start with a simple approach. And let's go ahead and actually build this. Let's go ahead and actually build this. Actions. All right, so let's go ahead and try to implement a model that does that sort of part. Okay. I'm going to, because everything else is just sort of, here's a bunch of state things, it goes and computes functions, that's sort of stuff we've done before. I'm going to skip that part and just focus on this selection part. Okay. So I'm going to imagine that I've got a stimulus that is, I don't know, I've got some input that is these 4 numbers. And I've got a group of neurons that is, say, we'll call this Q. This is, because this is my Q value is my utility of my 4 actions. I don't know, maybe we've got a 500 neurons, say 4-dimensional. And I'm going to feed in that value. All right, so I've got my sliders. These are my 4 utility values that are being computed by something else in a bigger system. And this is my group of neurons that's going to represent those 4 values. Right, and then maybe I've got a group of neurons that is, say, going to represent which is my actions. Ensemble neurons 500, dimensions is 4. All right, this is going to represent, all right, which action am I going to choose? Okay, and now I'm going to compute some function between them. Okay, and what function do I want? Well, hold on a second. This is really easy, right? Like, this is the function is just find the biggest number. Right? We know how to get neurons to approximate functions. So we're going to call this find maximum. I've got a bunch of different values there. How am I going to find out what's the biggest number in there? How do I write that? NumPy has a built-in function for that. So let's just use that. The index of the best one is the argmax of x. So that's going to tell me which item is the biggest. But I don't want to just return that number. I want to return 0, 0, 0, 0 with a 1 where the one that is biggest. So I'll just say result is 0, 0, 0, 0, and result index index equals 1, return result. All right, that's a perfectly fine function. And so now we just simply say, let's make a connection from Q to A that approximates that function. Right. That all seems fine. So let's go ahead and run that. So let's put in 0.2, whoops, 0.2, 0.3, actually, no, why do that way? Let's do it this way, 0.3, 0.7, 0.1, right? That's my example. So I'm now feeding in that value, and then I get out, oh, that looks pretty good. I'm getting one of them is near 1, the other ones are nice and near 0. This looks like it's doing a pretty good job of computing the function that I want. 0.2, 0.3, 0.7, 0.1. We're getting out some, here's our input, here's our output. It's not quite perfect, right? These things that are supposed to be near 0, they're not quite at 0. That's a little worrying. But this is more worrying. I'm putting in 2 things. They're both pretty big. What? There's this. Hold on. This is a problem, right? This is not what I've asked it to approximate. I've asked it to approximate, like, all of the examples in this function have outputs that are like all zeros with a single 1. This is not a good approximation. Why is it doing this? Neurons are having a difficult time approximating this function. If I want it to do a better job, one thing I can do is I can increase the number of neurons. You will notice I'm only increasing the number of neurons in this Q population. That's because the function's being approximated by the decoder. So increasing the number of neurons over here isn't going to change my decoder at all. It's these neurons where the decoder is going to be important. Maybe let's not do 5,000, let's do 2,000. No. Yes, it's going to be the case that as you put that number up high enough, eventually it's going to start doing a pretty good job. 3.7.1. Okay, good. It's doing a better job. Good. But it's still the case that it's not doing a good job when I've got 2 inputs that are pretty close to each other. Okay. The neurons are having a real hard time approximating this function. They're doing something, like they're doing in the right ballpark, right? But not good enough to make fine distinctions between, all right, I've got two things that are vaguely close. It's not really going to select one of them. Right? So, neurons are not, this is not the sort of function that neurons are good at computing. Argmax is a bit of a problem. What are we going to do about this? Right. So, highly nonlinear. Oh, right. And the other thing is, if I have more than 4 neurons, or 4 actions, things are just not going to scale up very well. Like it just gets even worse the more actions you have. So, not a happy solution. Now, one response to this is, hold on a second. This is kind of weird because, look, there's lots of people that use neural networks to compute the max of something. Right? This is even a standard thing. This is called a winner-take-all network, right? If you, like, this is a thing that exists in neural network literature is people, hey, I have a bunch of inputs. I want my neurons to find the biggest one. There's a thing called a winner-take-all network. And the idea is that all you do, heck, if you have 4 items and you just have 4 neurons, and you have 1 neuron for each item, and you have each neuron inhibit the other neurons and excite themselves. Okay? And then the idea is just simply, well, whatever you feed in as your input, whichever one has the largest value, it's going to inhibit the other ones the most, and so it's going to win, and so it's going to be the one that's most active. So why didn't we run in, so that's a thing that exists. We know neural networks can do that. And we also know that the neural engineering framework is supposed to like find the optimal best way of computing some function. Why didn't why didn't it find that solution? Well, the reason is that the solution is this idea of each item sort of inhibiting the other ones. That is a recurrent connection, right? When we were solving for decoders, we're solving for what's the best feed forward connection. What's the best decoding weights? What's the best, just give me one output. Here's my straightforward function that I'm computing. So we were asking it to solve this problem in a feed forward way. And of course, all right, that's not doable. So, but there is this known recurrent way. But that recurrent way that I just described, that's just math. Let's go ahead and implement that. Okay. So, and again, this is just this idea, right? So the idea in the math would be, all right, I have 4 values, I have 4 neurons, things that other people would call neurons. They're not spiking, they're just sort of the things that, they're just 4 values. And I'm going to make connections between these values such that if one value is large, that will make the other value smaller. And if one value is large, make it even larger. Okay, and that's sort of a classical neural network approach. And classical neural networks are just math and functions. And I know how to implement math and functions in neurons, so let's do this. Okay. And this is actually a sort of an important trick that you can do. There's lots of other neural network approaches out there, and people that have built neural networks to do different things. We can take any existing neural network and convert it into the neural engineering framework by just simply saying, hey, look, whatever they call a neuron, we're going to call an ensemble of spiking neurons. So even though they've made their network out of non-spiking neurons, we can approximate their stuff using spiking neurons or some other neuron model. So any other normal neural network we can convert over. Not sure if that made any sense. Let's go and implement it so we can actually see what I'm talking about there. Okay. All right, let's save this as actions 2. All right. So let's have this group of neurons. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, all right, I've still got the same sort of input of 4 values. And let's just simplify things, 0, 0, 0, 0. I'm going to have 4 different groups of neurons, one for each of these actions. Okay. I could code out and do a for loop and make 4 of them. That's just going to get a little annoying, so Nengo has a little helper function for this. It's called a Ensemble Array. This is just sort of a shortcut for defining 4 different neurons, or a bunch of neurons at once. And I just simply say, all right, how many neurons are in there? Let's say 50 neurons per ensemble, and the number of ensembles is 4. Okay, let's get rid of all this. All right, so I have this Q thing. That's my array of ensembles. If I double click on it, all right, there's my 4 ensembles. Yay, there they are. But I can also double click on it so they go away. And now I want to get this input going into all 4 of them. I could do something like, all right, make me a connection from the stimulus 0 to Q.ensembles 0. Right, that would be a connection from the first slider into this particular element there. But then I'd have to make 4 of those, and that's just annoying, so let's not do that. Let's just do this from a connection from the stimulus to Q.input. Okay, and Q.input, that means this little thing here, so that input is going to go there, and then get it split up and go to these 4 items. And then this graph is going to be all 4 of them. Cool. So that was just a shortcut for defining 4 ensembles. Sweet. Now I want to do this winner-take-all thing. All right. Yeah, let's do it as a separate group of neurons. Let's say that there's this other group of neurons called my answer. I'm going to go put over here. Okay, I'm going to make a connection from Q's output to A's input. Right. Okay, that's fine. So that's just passing the information straight on through. It's fine. Now let's go ahead and implement that winner-take-all thing. Now, what happens in a winner-take-all network? In a traditional winner-take-all network, what we're doing is we're taking whatever value is represented in this one, and we are subtracting that from the other 2, or for the other 3. Okay. And we're also taking whatever value is, and we usually have some sort of scaling factor that's being multiplied by. So we have some sort of weights that this one is imposing on the other ones. Okay. I could write that as a for loop of every single item interacting to every single other item, so that's like 16 different connections. That seems annoying, but the nice thing with those functions is those are all linear functions. Those are all functions of, let's just take whatever value is being represented and multiply it by multiply it by by some weight value. That's traditionally how these things are thought of as a neural network. Is, oh, if these were just 4 neurons, then I would just have a 4x4 connection weight matrix between all those 4 neurons. So let's make that matrix. What does that matrix look like? Well, we're going to have some amount of inhibition. We're going to have some scaling factor there. Let's define that. Maybe we'll want minus 0.5. There's going to be lots of ways of defining this matrix, but here would be one way. I0. Right, maybe let's draw that as a matrix just to sort of make it a little clearer what I've tried to do there. Right, so that would be a weight matrix that would, if I took the output from all these 4 neurons and multiplied them by that weight matrix, then that would be each of those neurons each neuron's connected to its neighbors and is trying to inhibit its neighbors. Right? Whatever, if my value is high, I'm multiplying my value by some negative number, that's pushing those things down. Right? Yeah, to be simpler, let's even drop it down to -1. Okay. Now what I'm going to do, instead of making 16 connections, each one being a scaling factor by one of these things, like what I really want is I want 16 connections, each one is sort of multiply my value by some number, by whatever that number is in the index. That's a linear operation, so I can do that this way. Make a connection from a.output to a.input with the transform is that weight matrix. Again, that's just a shortcut for making all 16 of those connections. And each connection would be just the linear function that is take this particular, take whatever value is being represented in that population and multiply it by some scaling factor. Okay. That would get the mutual inhibition sort of thing going on, and let's actually sort of see that. So let's say 2. All right, at least it should. Something is going very badly here. Let's actually complete this example, because normally in these sorts of things, you will also have some little bit of mutual self-excitation. So that's a connection from each component back to itself that is taking its value and multiplying by 0.5 and sort of adding that back onto itself. So that sort of is the traditional winner-take-all network that in a normal neural network approach, people have built these things for decades in order to find the maximum of something. And if we try that, it does not work at all. Let me feed in something. All right, and it seems to select 2 things. Why? I don't even know which ones it's selecting. Let's show the legend. It's selecting item. All right, I mean, this orange one is slightly higher. Right, maybe I can, something weird is happening here. Right, this is not doing the behavior that we want. Right, this is not, and in particular, it's selecting 2 things. Why is it selecting 2 things? A classic winner-take-all network should only select 1 thing. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is the neurons are trying to approximate exactly the function that we've been given it. Okay? And in a traditional neural network, if someone was trying to implement a winner-take-all circuit, it would be impossible for neurons to output negative numbers. Right? When in sort of old-style neural networks, yes, we have groups of neurons in here that are each of those groups of neurons are implementing what a traditional neural network person might call 1 neuron. But that group of neurons is representing a value between -1 and 1. In a traditional neural network where someone was going ahead and implementing this kind of operation, they would have a neuron that, say, only outputs positive values, and if it tries to be driven negative, it would just output a 0. Because what's happening here is if this group of neurons down here was representing a number, then a negative number times a negative number is a positive number. And so that'll start driving the other ones higher. Right? And that's not what is meant in a winner-take-all circuit. What's supposed to happen in a winner-take-all circuit is whoever's biggest starts inhibiting its neighbors, starts driving its neighbors down, but once their neighbors hit 0, so everyone's inhibiting each other, everyone's driving its neighbors down, but once they hit 0, they don't go farther down. You don't want to be having a negative number times a negative number, because now you're exciting your neighbors. Right? And that's what's happening here. So what we would really like to do is have these groups of neurons compute some other function. And we know how to do that. The particular function that maybe we want to compute is something like this. If x is less than 0, return 0, else return x. Right? So that would be, again, if I was doing this in a traditional neural network terms where these were 4 separate neurons, this would be a rectified linear neuron. But now what we're doing is we're using a group of leaky, integrate, and fire neurons to approximate a rectified linear neuron. Now we actually need to tell it to do this. There's syntax to put positive, to do this positive function. Yay. Whoops, not for Q, for A. There we are. So that has added a new output from this group of neurons. Now these connections here, what they're doing is they are approximating this particular function that I've asked for and collecting things together into one spot here. And now that I can now multiply by this matrix. So this is going to go down here. Positive. And that's where my loop is going to be now. So all I've done in sort of neural network terms is now I have a different, I'm decoding this function instead of decoding the identity function. And in particular, I'm decoding this function times this matrix. Okay. Now what do I get? Now it does a better job of selecting a single item. Yeah. Okay. So, some couple things to say about this. First of all, is it doing a better job of showing that output? Oh, instead of showing this output here, which is all of my utility values, let's show this positiveness thing. Let's remove that. Let's plot that value. Okay. Still a weighted sum of the activities of these neurons. Right? All of these graphs are always weighted sums of the activities of these neurons. It's just a weighted sum that computes this function instead of the identity function. Okay. I'm feeding in some input. This is my output. It says 0, 0, 0, and one of them is high. This is exactly what we're looking for. Right? It's identified, yes, this item is the largest. Make this one a little higher. Ooh, now it's picking that action. Make this one a little higher. Hold on a second. Oh, maybe I got to make it really high for it to switch over. This is a standard problem with these sorts of... So first of all, it's sort of doing the task. Right? It is able to pick the biggest. But it has a bit of a problem if two things are kind of close. Basically, you need to have a pretty big difference before it'll switch. Okay. This is a standard thing with winner-take-all networks. They have what's called hysteresis. They have some memory of the past. Once they've chosen an action, they lock into that action until there's a bigger difference. You can control this by playing around with how much self-excitation there is. You can make it a little bit better for swapping. Okay, so now it'll still swap between these two actions. Right. And this is exactly the behavior you would see in a normal winner-take-all network. And then you could play around with these scaling factors. Okay, so let me step back from that for a moment. What I've shown here, so one thing that I've shown here is a general method for if someone has some non-biologically realistic neuron model. If they just have something that is a bunch of components with connections between them, all we're pointing out is I know if these components are computing some function, I know how to take whatever that function is and approximate it using a more realistic neuron model or some other neuron model. So even if someone has some sort of design of something that works for rectified linear neurons, I can approximate those rectified linear neurons using some other neuron model, be it biologically realistic or sigmoid or some other thing. So that's one thing I'm pointing out here, is this is a general method for if someone has a model like that and you want to implement it in a more biologically realistic way, here is one approach. So that's one aspect that we're saying out of all this. The other aspect we're saying is, yes, you can build a winner-take-all network using this sort of neural engineering framework approach. This is now a winner-take-all network. It's using groups of neurons instead of single neurons, but that also means it's a lot more flexible in terms of what functions are being computed and things like that, and we could probably drop the number of neurons pretty far and still have it behave right. However, using a winner-take-all network to do action selection doesn't scale particularly well. So we have this so if these sliders were being computed by a bunch of things that we're saying, okay, what action should I do next? This is a possible approach if you have a fairly small number of actions. As you scale up your number of actions, it becomes harder and harder to find scaling factors here that are going to work well for the particular task that you want, or you're going to hit situations where it starts taking a very long time for it to settle on one action or another. Right? You're going to end up in situations where it's like something like this, and it's just you're going to end up having these fairly long sequences. So here I changed the value here, and it took a very long time for it to swap its action over. Okay? Very long time. What is that? That was this is about a half-second window, so this is something like 200 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds. Maybe in some situations that's fast enough for a biological creature. Faster might be better, and certainly it gets harder and harder as your number of neurons goes up. Okay. So we're gonna take a different approach. Okay, so basically this is a possible approach if you have a fairly small number of actions. Doesn't scale particularly well. Okay. All right. Let's get back to these notes. Right. Yeah, so there's still a problem or two. So this is what I'm saying. We can use leaking rate and fire neurons to approximate other things. There's still going to be, even if we go ahead and fix these things and we have it approximate some other, like a rectified linear function, we still have this scaling problem. We still have this hysteresis problem. Once one thing is chosen, it's hard to switch to another action. Right. And in particular, it makes it very difficult and very slow when you have situations like this, where my inputs are a bunch of large numbers and one that's even bigger. It becomes very difficult to have a system that works for that, and this other situation with a bunch of small numbers and one that's bigger. Kind of difficult. Okay, that's not a perfect way of implementing a max function. It works pretty well. If you have fairly small numbers of actions and fairly well-known distributions of those Q values. If they don't tend to look like this, then you can probably get away fine with that sort of winner-take-all circuit. When building cognitive models with this sort of approach, one answer is just simply say, look, fine, there's lots of weird details for this part. Let's just go ahead and compute the max and don't worry about it, because this is something computers are really good at computing the max. So maybe we just don't worry about this part of biological realism, or we do it in some other way. And there's whole families of researchers that go that approach, and that's great. I think there's all sorts of possibilities they can do with that. I'd like to sort of, let's nail this down. Let's go a little bit farther, and let's see if we can pick this apart a little bit more to get this action selection not skipping any steps. So what's another option? Let's look to the brain. This is supposed to be a course about simulating neurobiological systems. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about the brain, because this is one of the situations where there's some pretty strong evidence that we know where this sort of activity is going on in the brain. Let's look at the brain. Can we figure out what this structure is doing? All right. So the general rule of thumb, action selection seems to be being something to do with the basal ganglia. Right? It is a situation where all of cortex connects into it. So that would be the idea of, all right, those would be the connections that are computing this Q value, that are computing how good a particular actions are in these states. One of the main outputs from the basal ganglia is the thalamus, which the general rule of thumb there is the part of the thalamus that seems to be really involved in routing information between brain areas. So that seems good for doing this sort of control. Diseases of the basal ganglia seem to cause interesting control problems. Parkinson's and Huntington's would be sort of the most well-known examples. And it being sort of very difficult to trigger actions being triggered inappropriately. It is interesting that a lot of these symptoms, like it's the physical actions that are most obvious, but there's also a lot of evidence that there are cognitive actions as well. It's difficult to trigger cognitive actions. So there's that whole family of data saying, okay, maybe this is about action selection. And then there's also a whole bunch of data, like we always said that reinforcement learning seems to be doing something about, here's a bunch of actions, please adjust, hey, learn that this action is good in this state. The basal ganglia is where there's tons of data that reward signals seem to feed into the system, and this is where dopamine and that all those sorts of stories seem to converge. So there's reasons to believe the basal ganglia has a bunch of structures in it. It's this thing over here. Over here, this is sort of the old canonical picture of the basal ganglia. You're getting input from all of cortex. It's got these two major pathways. There's the direct pathway and the indirect pathway. That's what they're called. We've got these components. Fine. This is the dopamine reward signal going on here. That's the traditional picture. Of course, it's a brain, so everything's more complicated. This is sort of the more modern picture. Basically, everything's connected to everything else, but same sort of story is there. But that's all right. So that's a picture. What have people done to try to understand this? Couple different approaches. One approach has been that, okay, what's happening here is I have a groups of neurons up here that are, I have one set of neurons that are sort of, should I do this action, and another set of neurons, should I not do this action? Right? And then what's happening here, this blue line is because this connection happens to be inhibitory, this happens to be inhibitory, this is inhibitory, this is excitatory. So this is multiplying by -1, this is multiplying by -1, this is multiplying by -1, this is multiplying by +1. This is sort of the high-level story. And the idea is, if you did a winner-take-all up here, and then you inverted it, and then if you did a winner-take-all over here, and you inverted it twice, then you would have a good signal for okay, one of these would be indicating, should I do the action? One of the things should be not do the action. So one possible story is all of the action selection winner take all sort of thing happens up here, and then the rest of the basal ganglia structure is just for inverting signals in order to say, yes, I should do this, no, I shouldn't. That's one general thing. Oh, and also in that inversion process, it turns out this output from the basal ganglia, if you take a look at particular sort of neurons that seem to be active when there's different actions, we seem to be in a situation where, okay, the neurons are generally always active, and then they stop firing when an action is chosen. That tends to be the way around things are going. So maybe you can imagine it's representing it this way rather than this way. but whatever, similar sorts of story. Again, this is sort of that common approach would be you do mutual inhibition to do that selection process, and then you invert the signal a few times. That's totally possible. There's lots of interesting research that goes in that direction. I think there's some cool stories about why we are splitting these two processes that sort of ongoing. It still strikes me as a little weird of having the story of doing some sort of double inversion process. That seems, why not just go directly from here to here and just skip this double inversion? So I've always sort of had a few little worried about that. There's tons of stuff going on in the brain. Maybe it's being used in aspects of the learning. Maybe it's being used to doing something else. There's all sorts of possibilities. Maybe it's just a historical accident. There's tons of possible answers there, but it's not the direction that I went. There's another line of reasoning saying that, okay, well, hold on a second. Maybe what this extra structure is doing is a recognition that this mutual inhibition thing, this winner-take-all thing, is going to be kind of difficult. And maybe what we're trying to do is have this rest of this structure is all about trying to do winner-take-all without that mutual inhibition approach. That it needs to be in a way that's sort of fast, scalable, and robust. Right. This is work out of the Redgrave lab, 2001. It's been built on since then. They were doing this sort of initial pass of this theory, not worrying about spiking neurons, so just worrying about like traditional old-style neural networks. I just have components that are just outputting values between 0 and 1. They're just doing some math, and I have connection weights that are, my output is just whatever the activity of this neuron is times this. Okay? And there's no spiking. They were just, let's simplify this down and let's try to build things. And the way they were imagining it is a winner-take-all system. You can sort of unroll the loop and just do sort of one pass of it. Like I can do a feed-forward value approach of a winner-take-all system. It wouldn't be as good, but we could do that. All right. And then you can take this and you can reorganize the structure a little bit, because in biology it's hard to mix excitatory and inhibitory things together. So if you reorganize it a bit, you end up with something that does exactly an unrolled iteration through a winner-take-all network, but that is separated out in an interesting way. That sort of maps onto the biology and even maps onto some details of the biology. So for instance, the striatum component here, the reason it's called the striatum is that the connections in it are striated. It looks like big straight lines. It doesn't look like connections all over the place. And that's exactly the sort of connections that you get here. Okay, so there's some interesting connections that they kind of liked. But in order to make this system sort of robust to a wider range of inputs, they needed to add on to the diagram I just had there was this little bottom component. They added on these little top components that does a little bit of feedback, and that maps onto the biology, that seems to make it a lot faster and scalable. Now, they did a lot of work to try to analyze this math, and they found that they really couldn't analyze the math, and they just needed to run the simulations and see what happens. And so that's the structure that they built, and they just simply said, okay, cool, let's go ahead and implement that. Okay. And see what behavior is. We came along, this is actually some of the early work that I did when I joined Chris Eliasmith's lab, and said, all right, they've already built this model that scales up to thousands of actions. It selects things really quickly. There's very little hysteresis in it, but they all built it up out of rectified linear rate neurons. And that's not what's in the brain. But I just showed you a method for taking any rate neuron model, any sort of linear, some simple neuron model like this, and converting it into spiking neurons. All right, let's just do exactly the approach that I just did. Let's go in, build this exact same thing. Anything that they called a neuron, we're going to call a group of neurons. Whatever the sort of the nonlinearity is that they wanted those neurons to have, we'll just say, all right, let's get leaky integrate and fire neurons to approximate that function. that function times whatever weights that they wanted on these connections. Okay. So we went and did that. We also sort of constrain things because they know there's lots of great data about what the time constants of the neurotransmitters are, what the firing rates of neurons are in those neurons. And we went ahead and built that model. And now that you've got that model, now you can do things like, well, how long does it take to select an action? Okay. And there is biological data about how long it takes when you change an input. How long does it take for the basal ganglia to, the neurons that are sensitive to one action, how long does it take for them to stop firing, and how long does it take for the other neuron, when I'm no longer choosing that action. Okay. And this is actually one of the situations where there's zero free parameters in the model. Like when I run that model for the first time, it's either going to work or it's not going to work, because everything is constrained. Like I know, my time constants, I know my sorts of firing rates. I could probably change the number of neurons a little bit, but that doesn't really affect this value much. And it was just a matter of, all right, let's do the same experiment that they do on real creatures. Change a stimulus that'll sharply change the action. See how long it takes for the neurons to stop firing. And in biology, in the model, it turned out to take 15.1 milliseconds. In biology, the answer was it takes sometimes between 14 and 17 milliseconds. And that was one of the sort of first pure predictions. I was like, oh, cool, maybe this sort of approach to modeling biology might actually be right. Cool. Anyway, that is exactly what we're now going to use in this, to go ahead and build up these models. All right, so let's go ahead and implement that in Nengo. I'm not going to go through all the details of everything that it takes to go and implement that, but the nice thing is, let's save this as actions 3. The nice thing is, this is now something that is built into Nengo. So I can go ahead and build a basal ganglia with 4 actions. There we are. I have a basal ganglia. All right. Let's get rid of all this. Right. Let's get rid of that connection as well. Okay. I have a bit. So this is the basal ganglia. It's got all those components in it. It's actually built very similarly to the winner-take-all thing that we were looking at a moment ago. So we're just sort of building all those things in. We're going to make a connection from Q's output to the basal ganglia's input. And then we can make a connection from basal ganglia's output to this action thing's input. Yeah, whoops, helps if I do the connection after I make the thing. Okay. Let's go zoom out a little bit, put this over here. Whoa. Move components around. Stimulus, Q, basal ganglia, output. Show my value. Okay. And so, one thing to note, first of all, that since this is supposed to be built like a real basal ganglia, we're having its output be whatever we're choosing is actually a value of 0, and all of the other things are going to be some non-zero value. Okay, so that's what we're plotting down here. And we're sort of seeing that we're choosing one action. So there's one action. That's the intent of the system. There'll be one action that is sitting near 0. Yes, it's not perfect. If you feed in really close values, it does not do a good job of making sure you only do one value. Okay. But it will work pretty well across a much wider range of inputs, and with much larger range of number of inputs than the other approaches that have been found. Okay. If we want to convert this, all right, that'll give us our sort of action selection. If we want to convert this into something cleaner with that sort of ones and zeros, like let's have one value be 1 and the other values be 0. That seems useful. What we're going to do instead is we're going to add a little bit of a winner-take-all on this component here. Okay. And we're going to call that, we've got a built-in version of that here, which we're going to call a thalamus. And we're just going to get rid of that. We're going to connect this to the thalamus as input. There we are. So that's, again, that is just the same circuit we were building before with a little winner-take-all on it. Just to, whoops, come on. Just to clean that up a little bit more. So with that, we should be doing a pretty good job of, all right, there's one action being chosen. So we sort of combine the two approaches, and that seems to give us a pretty robust system that is going to do a nice job of switching between a bunch of actions near 0, actually exactly at 0. You'll notice that this is exactly 0. What we've done there is we've just chosen tuning curves such that when you're representing a value near 0, there are no neurons firing. And so, of course, you're going to decode out the value exactly 0 because no neurons are firing. Right. So that makes a very, very clean 0 and a pretty good job of choosing these other actions. Okay. So that is the sort of biologically based action selection system. That seems to have been the most robust thing that we can find. And that's what we've been using for all of our large-scale cognitive models. Cool. Let's go back here. That's our overall process. We have, and that is our model of action selection. Is it the only model? No. It has been a pretty robust model. We haven't really modified that model in about a decade of using it. It's been sort of cool. This is a component that we're going to use in lots and lots and lots of different tasks. There's lots more that could be done for doing comparisons to biology and things like that. And we certainly have added learning aspects, as we'll get into next week. But that's the overall structure that we're looking at. So that chooses an action. I do want to briefly sort of say, okay, now that we know what action to perform, how do we actually perform it? And there's a couple different possibilities. In that critter example, we all actually had the two somewhat, or I guess we had sort of one aspects of possibilities. So what we had in the critter example, the actions were things like, if I'm scared, or sorry, if I'm not scared, then my action is take whatever information was in one group of neurons and send it to another group of neurons. And we implemented that as okay, I've got a group of neurons, and I'm just going to do an if statement. I'm just going to approximate a function that is an if statement. So that's one common thing that sort of jumped out. There's another set of actions when we've been building these more cognitive actions that's more like, well, if the phrase that I'm being given is true about my mental model, so going back to the example I showed at the beginning of this, of doing the is A left of B sort of model, in that, one of the actions was just, well, if that works, then just route the fixed value valid to this other group of neurons. So it's just sending a fixed value somewhere. And all that ends up being in the interest of time, I'm not really going to go into this. There's, yeah. All right, well, in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into these particular examples of how we are splitting these things up. Do I want to? Sure, okay, let's actually do it. All right, a simple action. Let's go ahead and look at these things. Good. Because what this is saying is I want to do something with this decision that's coming out of here. Okay. So one thing I might have is an action that is, I don't know, let's make a, let's just call this, I've got A is an ensemble, neurons is 50, dimensions is 1. Okay, and let's say my action 1, this action over here, is if this is the action that I'm choosing, then set A to 0.5. Okay. All right, how would I implement that? Well, I would say make a connection from thalamus output 0 to A, where the function is just take that value and multiply it by 0.5. Right? Because again, these actions in the thalamus are going to be 0 if I'm not choosing the action, 1 if I am choosing the action. 1 times 0.5 is going to be 0.5. Okay, so that should be, so A is sitting there at 0 most of the time. I'm choosing some other action, I'm choosing some other action, I'm choosing some other action. Now if I choose this action, oh, A is now 0.5. I don't choose the action, A goes back to 0. Okay, it's going to be 0.5, A goes back to 0. Is it going to be exactly 0.5? We're going to have some scaling factors in there. That's going to be a little bit iffy. But it should be, you know, again, it's not going to be perfect, but it's not bad. It's not going to be affected much by exactly how strongly we're choosing that action. Okay. So that's one possible, that's a nice simple action to implement. Okay. There's another, but that other type of action we had would be something like, I have a group of neurons and another group of neurons. And maybe what I want my action to be is that if this action is chosen, then take whatever it is in B, and I'm going to have some input to B so that I can actually control that. Oops, node. And make a connection from stim B to B. There we go. So I can now actually control the value in B. And you know, maybe that's some other sensory thing, but now what I want my action to be is if action 2 is chosen, then route the information from B to C. That's a very similar thing to what we had with the critter example. One way to do it would be exactly what we described in the critter example, which was, okay, I'm going to make this intermediate group of neurons. Which has both values in it. Right, B choice, which has a connection from B to B choice 0, and a connection from thalamus 1 to B choice 1. So again, as a reminder, whoops, thalamus 1 dot output. Okay, so as a reminder, this thing is now a 2-dimensional population. 1 dimension is being driven by am I choosing this action, and one dimension is being chosen by am I what this actual b value is. C function, and then I can do something like if x1 is greater than 0, so if I'm choosing that value, let's say if it's really big, because it should be jumping from 0 to 1, so we'll say if it's greater than 0.5, then return x0, otherwise return 0. Make a connection from B choice to C, where the function is C func. All right, now in theory, go ahead and build this. And now if I choose this action, C, all right, so if I'm choosing, so I'm currently choosing action 2, all right, and so that means that this information from B is being passed through to C. Okay. But if I choose a different action, now this information from C, or from B, is not being passed through to C. Okay. If I choose the action again, now it is being passed through. Okay. That's one way to implement this, sort of passing through. And that's similar to what we did in this critter example. There is an interesting simplification here that I'm going to show off just because I can. Let's call this actions 4. And what's this simplification? There is a cool thing you can do in this one special case where my function is the output should be 0 most of the time, and in other particular cases the function is just whatever my input is. Okay. And what we're going to do here is we're going to actually do some sort of hybrid model between NEF, normal NEF style neural network stuff, and more hand-designed neural networky stuff. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this B choice thing, I'm going to make it one-dimensional. And I'm only going to feed into it this B value. Okay. Let's make all that go away. Okay. So I'm going to make this there. Oh, and I'm just going to do a connection from B choice to C. So this is just a communication channel. Like, like whatever B is, C is always going to get that. But what I want is I want there to be some situations where C gets nothing from here. And one way I could do that would be to just totally shut down the firing of this population. If I had another input, which when this, so normally this thing, so if there was no external input, this thing would just pass information straight through it. But if I had an external input that was purely inhibitory, okay, and forget this whole NEF, like doing decoder thing, no, just give me a whole bunch of inputs that just shut down all the neurons in this population. Then whenever that external input existed, C would just do nothing. Okay. And we have this cool situation where the neurons in this thalamus, I've already organized them such that when the action is being chosen, the information for this basal ganglia is already set up such that when an action is being chosen, we have a bunch of neurons not firing, but when they are, other way around. When they are not being chosen, the neurons fire, and when they are chosen, they stop firing. So that's a beautiful candidate for neurons that I should just be able to connect right into here and inhibit this population. So I can do that in Nengo by just taking the basal ganglia's output, that particular output, and connect it to the B choice neurons themselves. But that's going to give me an error because I've got like 100 neurons here and this is only one value. What should I do? So I need to add in a manually created transform matrix. Ones, and this is a big matrix of, well, let's have it's a whole bunch of -10s. Right, this is a big giant inhibitory weight matrix that is 100 by 1 in size. So that's going to say whenever the basal ganglia is not choosing this action, inhibit these neurons. And when it is choosing the action, stop inhibiting these neurons. Okay. So, right now, I take B, it's not being passed through to C. I choose the action, whoops. And now we're passing information through to C. Okay. Interestingly, the output from the basal ganglia is primarily, in the actual biological brain, is primarily inhibitory. So this is also an interesting trick that can be used for efficiently implementing these sorts of models. Okay. It doesn't sort of conceptually change things, but it does make things a little bit more efficient. Like having this group of neurons just represent one dimension rather than 2 dimensions makes things a little bit more efficient. But it's a trick that only works for functions exactly of this form, where the function is do nothing, pass the information through, or do nothing at all, output 0. And so you can do tricks like that. All right. Weird sort of side aspect. Cool. So that is the basic structures that we've used for building up large cognitive, doing sort of programming of algorithms that involve multiple steps using this basal ganglia thalamus cortex loop. And the idea overall is that the cortex is going to connect to the basal ganglia and compute these functions of should I, it's a whole bunch of actions. Should I do action 1? Should I do action 2? Should I do action 3? The purpose of the basal ganglion thalamus is to figure out, okay, or the connections from the basal ganglia to the thalamus is going to be figuring out, all right, which of those actions should be set to 1. And then the thalamus, the connections coming out of the thalamus, the things that I do with it are all the sort of things, examples that I just showed of, all right, use that value to go change other neuron states. Okay, do some function that is multiplied by that activity value. These are all functions that are like, do nothing if I'm not choosing that action, otherwise do whatever the function says. Cool. So that exists. We've been attempting to build sort of syntax and things to help build these sorts of models a little bit nicer. Because as you can see, this starts getting a little bit messy. This is sort of the low-level details of what you would build up. I want to do, I think, 2 examples actually of using, because I introduced, when we did the semantic pointer stuff, I introduced this Nengo SPA library. And so I just want to actually show a quick example to give you an idea of how that sort of thing can be done. What we're going to do is, let's do a simple example that is, how do I want to phrase this? That is about doing this sequence of actions. And I'm probably gonna mess up my syntax, but that'll be fine. All right. So one thing that I introduced last time was the SPA.state thing. This is a group of neurons. It's going to represent some d-dimensional vector. I'm going to do 64-dimensional vectors. Right, and the example I want to do is just, if I'm thinking about the letter A, then think about B. If I'm thinking about B, think about C, C, D, and so on. So it's just a sort of a simple, not quite counting example, but alphabet example. And what we're going to do is, oops, I just want to make sure that I'm getting my syntax right. Let's see. I just want to make sure I'm remembering this right. B goes to memory. Cool, I actually remembered my syntax correctly. All right, what the heck am I doing there? So the idea with listing a bunch of actions is I'm going to list a bunch of these if-max statements. And this if-max means do this if this is the maximum action. Okay, so it's not quite an if statement. Like in normal symbolic reasoning, it would be sort of, I'd have this big set of if-then statements. But what I'm doing here is I'm saying, let's be a little bit more explicit that what I'm doing is I'm doing some math, and whichever one of these maths gives me the biggest number, that's the thing I'm going to do. So if this is the max, then do one thing. If this is the max, do something else. So, and what do I mean by the max? So I'm trying to define a function here. And what so this here is going to be a function that computes a scalar value. Okay. And what I'm saying is this is so memory. So that's this thing that I've created here. So if the thing that I'm thinking about, if the dot product between the thing that I'm thinking about and the symbol B, let's import SPA. Let's simplify this syntax a little bit. S. We'll say, let's just do that. Okay. I just needed some way of defining a particular symbol. So if that dot product is what's highest, so the utility of this action is the dot product between whatever's in memory and A. The utility of this action is whatever's in memory and B. Okay. And then there's two things being given for each of these actions. One of them is what's the condition, what's the math that I'm going to do in order to figure out what the utility of this action is. And then the other thing I'm going to do is what action should I do? And this action here is send the letter B to memory. And this action is going to be send the letter C to memory. Okay. Whoops. Import mango SPA dot. Oh, does that not work? Fine. S equals SPA dot symbol. There we are. That's better. So that's 2 actions, 3 actions, 4 actions, 5 actions. If I'm thinking about C, if I'm thinking about D, if I'm thinking about E, if I'm thinking about C, then send D to memory. If I'm thinking about D, then E to memory. If I'm thinking about E, then send A to memory. Let's do an auto layout there, see what the hell we've got here. We now have a basal ganglia, we have a memory system, we have this if-then thing, we have this thalamus. This memory system, I can build up my cloud, and now I can run this model. Okay. And what we can do, let's actually show the, let's show the output from the thalamus, because that's going to say what action we're doing. Okay. Try that again. Okay. And I'm going to set the value of this memory to A, and then I'm going to take it off. Right. And there we are now going through. It is switching from A to B to C to D to E. Right. And we can actually see that A, B, C, D, E, A, B. Right. And in fact, and then we can see in here which action is being chosen. It's the actions A, B. Let's show the legend. Right. It's first, second, third, fourth, fifth action, and cycling on through those actions. Okay. And you will note that it takes a certain amount of time for it to cycle through those actions. Again, in cognitive science theory, people have sort of indicated this number should be around 50 milliseconds. For these simple actions, it actually turns out to be closer to 40 milliseconds. If I do more complicated actions, so for instance, if I have my vision, and then I say, all right, one of these actions, when I get to the end, instead of starting over at A, let's start over at whatever's in vision. Okay, so what am I doing here? Now I'm saying I have this memory thing. I have another cloud here. So now what I'm saying is if we are, I'm going to set the value to A, set my memory initially to D, right? Let's take away that D, all right. And let's take away, we'll leave that there. Set value to A, take it away. Oh, come on, we gotta build that a little bit faster here. Vision. Let's just crank that up. Just looked like the memory was slightly fading away here. Oh, I know what I forgot to do. All right. What I forgot to do is to give it something to do if none of those top ones are the right thing to do. Right. And what we're going to do is just simply give it an action that, hey, if nothing is really big, then do this. Right? So this is just an action that has just a constant 0.5. Okay, let's go build this and see what happens. Set value to A. Move that. And we're going to get this thalamus output value. Come on. Let's go ahead and do this. Nope, and we keep recycling right at the beginning. Come on. Click in. Of course, live examples are not going to work nicely. So I'm going to set this value. So this is being a little bit too weak, or a little bit too strong now. Take that away. Oh, come on. All right, let's not do the live example. Let's do the built-in example that has exactly the same model, but with some different scaling factors. Fine. There it is. This is using the older syntax that we are in the midst of fixing. Let's make this happen. Oh, sorry. That's what I forgot to do. I forgot to make the memory an actual memory that was holding its value all the time. Sorry, that's the thing I forgot to do. I forgot to make that memory something that actually stored its state over time. All right, whatever. That was embarrassing. But the point is that now we have this system that now will still count, but I can change where it starts counting from. So now it's counting CDE, CDE, CDE. Right, so it's starting at whatever I say is starting here. Here we get a cool situation where the time it takes to route this information to memory is actually longer, and it takes sort of closer to 70 milliseconds. So we have fast actions that take about 40 milliseconds, these sorts of more complex actions that take about 70 milliseconds when you're routing information around, and the average seen from lots of cognitive psychology data is about 50 milliseconds. All right, enough for that example. I just want to finish things off. So that's the data that we were saying there of different timing. Yes, you can build up pretty much anything out of that. There's going to be some interesting constraints about the total number of actions. Given the size of the basal ganglia in humans, there's probably a limit of somewhere around 1 million possible actions. But we do have that sort of, the fact that things are smooth and continuous, a little bit noisy, is going to sort of limit what you can build up. And we've done a bunch of different examples of different things. The most complex sort of logic long task that we've done is the Tower of Hanoi task, where this is sort of a move rings around, but it's sort of well known what are the sets of internal actions that once someone has learned this task, you have to move the rings from one peg to another, and you're only allowed to move one ring at a time, and you can't put a bigger ring on top of a smaller ring. So that task has been studied rather extensively. It even shows up in video games now and then. But there's once someone is an expert in that task, there's a well-known set of rules that people look at. And the reason that we know people follow those rules is that you get this really interesting pausing behavior. The amount of time between moves follows a really regular pattern. And we went ahead and took these rules, implemented in the basal ganglia using exactly what I was showing. And it produced not exact, we definitely got some of the behavior from the humans, so there's still some open questions about, okay, we're not exactly fitting it here, but we're getting some of the key aspects from the human data. Okay, complex models require action selection. As you're doing more and more complicated things, there's lots of different things you could do at a given time. You need to choose something. Two different ways that we sort of showed how to do it. If you only have a small number of actions, then you can do the normal sort of neural network mutual inhibition winner-take-all type system. That can work really well for just choosing a couple actions. Or we can do this basal ganglion model that I just showed. Once you have an action that's selected, we go and execute that action with normal Nengo sorts of methods. And so if it's if you have high-level cognitive task and you want to implement it this way, you've got to break it down into these low-level basic actions and just implement each one. It can be a difficult process. What we're going to look at next week is to start looking at, can we start introducing learning? We're start learning about that sort of aspect. The overall idea is going to be that maybe one way that one can do this sort of approach is, instead of trying to do neural networks where it learns everything from scratch, we can use the approaches that we've seen here of, I can build an initial neural network that is sort of a pretty good guess about what I think this task could be, and maybe it can learn from there, and then maybe that can be an improvement over standard ways of doing cognitive modeling. All right, thank you very much. We will go on to learning in the next class. Thanks, and we will see you later. Bye.